Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up Series podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site that covers, of course, your Arizona Cardinals. And this is one of our normal shows, not one of our Cardinals camp updates with Howard Balser, although there will be one of those coming as well. Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site, is with me, and we have our normal weekly show that will end up being a couple of shows during the week, but we're going to keep pumping out the content. This is going to be either episode 574 or 575. It depends on whether I get this episode out first or whether Howard's camp update from Tuesday, I get that out instead. And Seth, it's preseason week 1. There's two practices left of training camp at State Farm Stadium. I went to a couple of practices. Next week they're on the road, their only home game of the preseason. So we're basically there. Like, football is right around the corner, and now we get to see these guys in live action, at least the non-starters for the most part.
Yeah, it's that time where it's football, but it's not great football, but it's better than no football. And so it's just one of those things that we're excited, man. It should be a good season. Obviously the biggest thing that, has already not happened is that we're just waiting and hoping to get through this injury situations and get into the regular season. Obviously, injuries happen in the regular season all the time too, right? Like, it's part of the game. It sucks. It is what it is. But at the end of the day, we want to get to the regular season and at least see what this team could be. And unfortunately, before the season even gets started, before even a snap in preseason, right, we don't get to do that. And that's unfortunate, because one of the guys that you and I were really looking forward to this year, to really see what he was and what he potentially could be, after basically a what would you call it? Maybe a half a rookie season, maybe.
Yeah, it was essentially that. BJ Ojulari, second round pick last year out of LSU. Was one of our breakout players to look at this year. Was in a perfect spot because he started getting more playing time late last year, was getting productive, was healthy all off season, looked great in OTAs and minicamp, and looked great, honestly, in training camp. And after just a week after Jonathan Gannon and everyone was talking about how healthy the Cardinals were, suddenly they put pads on and injuries started happening. The Froholt gets hurt, but he's back. Lots of little injuries, it seems, but the major one, BJ Ojulari tearing his ACL on Friday. He's done for the year. Arguably one of the guys on the defense where you least could afford. Like, he was the guy you could least afford to lose for the year for any significant amount of time, because of how that edge room looks in terms of the pass rush. He's the only one that gives you natural pass rushing talent, and now you're going to have to manufacture that stuff again.
Yeah, and it's not just that you're going to have to manufacture it. And I don't want to sound, hyperbolic, but you genuinely just don't even know if this is a guy you can count on moving forward, right? Like, obviously slightly big news that I don't see on our schedule to talk about, so I'll just bring it up. They re-signed Zaven Collins to a 2-year contract extension. Very moderate deal. I mean, were you a little surprised by how moderate the deal was?
I can't wait to see, Not really, because I think Zaven understands in terms of the position he plays, he hasn't
Earned more.
he hasn't earned the pass rusher money, and being 2 extra years, and it was really, the timing was like, oh, BJ goes down, so we got to make sure we've got Zaven here. And we've talked about just how I actually forgot to put this on the schedule, one of those things that, but yeah, we should definitely talk about Zaven, because we've talked about it. We've known this, just how much they love Zaven Collins in the building. And Zaven has the right mentality. He's got an I don't know if I believe this shtick. He's like, I grew up in a town that's got no stoplights, still got no stoplights. So there's a little bit of the small town aw shucks shtick to him about how he talked about his new deal. But the truth of the matter is, he's sort of kind of the opposite in mentality of Isaiah Simmons, right? Simmons wanted, like, and I'm okay with that. Like, he wanted to be a star. Like, he wanted to be one of the best players. And Zaven puts his head down and is like, yeah, and wanted to be here, wanted to be part of it, and a nice 2-year deal. And I want to see what the true numbers end up being, but that, I think it's especially when he still hasn't proven anything. You can largely see him as probably a failure at inside backer, because he didn't stick there, and he hasn't yet proven to be even above average edge defender. He's just a solid like right now, he's a solid 2-down player. But when it comes to the arguably the most important part of the edge, of producing disruption in the passing game, he doesn't do. He does all the other things else, but he sets the edge really well. He's very smart. He's a short tackler in the run game. He, in fact, coming off of that position, his play in coverage is fantastic from that spot, and very much like what we saw from Hassan Reddick when they finally moved him to the edge. Like, the troubles in coverage that he had suddenly disappeared because it was a more instinctual drop. And so that's the next step. And now this ends up being an absolute bargain of a deal if somehow he becomes an 8+ sack guy, which I think is possible. But it just something we said, they love Zaven, and they proved it by and this is now it finally gives another one of Keim's first round picks a second contract. and Kyler and Zaven.
And it's funny to think about this, but it really does set up Zaven for the future. One, if he's bust as an edge player, and just never really turns into more than Matt Shaughnessy 2.0. Obviously a little bit better because he's like you said, good in coverage, good athlete, those things, but basically a slightly more athletic version of Matt Shaughnessy. He gets paid probably more than he's worth. If he starts to break out, he's only 27. That contract's up. That's a 3-4 year, $70-80 million contract. And who knows, in 2027, when he's a free agent, right? We could be talking about, a 4-year, $100 million contract for edge defenders that are average, slightly above average.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's truly one of those things that it probably works better for Zaven right now in what he has done, because it's like you said, we got to see what the money actually is, but at least you're going to know that there's some guaranteed money there, right? And
we're right. He was already getting $2.7 million this year, and according to the initial numbers, is that there's 11.25 in guaranteed money. How much of that is like fully guaranteed, or is called guaranteed because there are bonuses that he can be paid later? We'll have to wait and see. But the fact of the matter is, he does get additional security than what he had before, and he signed through 2 more years. So I'm sure he's getting, wouldn't you say, probably $4 million up front.
Yeah,
And probably will have a minimum salary. So like his year one payout will probably be about $5.5 million.
Yeah.
And then so he's doubling his money this year and still is under contract next year. And probably his 2025 salary is also fully guaranteed, I would bet.
Yeah, and so what that does for him is, it basically is a fallback. Like, hey, unfortunately, if you don't turn out, you got paid, and you got paid probably more than you were worth. But if you do turn out, you set yourself up to get another, a big contract, at least one big contract. And if you ever are fortunate enough to talk to guys that play in the NFL or played in the NFL, they'll all tell you the same thing. They're all looking for that one big guaranteed contract,
right?
They're for every guy
that second contract. Now, first round picks have it well. They do. So Zaven, honestly, he's in a really good spot already financially, but you really cash in contract 2.
Right. But having Zaven, you were looking at it as like, okay, we've got the Rock. Now we've got to find somebody that can rush the passer. And the hope was that was going to be BJ Ojulari. And now, we just don't even know. And it's one of those situations where it's just, it's super unfortunate because it's not a guy's fault when he gets injured. Like I've always said that, people always talk about Andre Wadsworth being a bust. Was he a bust? I mean, the guy can't walk. Literally, like if you ever see him, he can't walk.
Those are sad busts. Is like
right. They're not
Wendell Bryant. That's
right.
a different story. But no,
right.
Andre Wadsworth, when you've got all the talent in the world and your body fails, and it's not for lack of effort. And this isn't like ACL injuries are weird. They really are. Like, just take Dre Greenlaw in the Super Bowl when he blew out his Achilles. He's literally just I'm gonna run back on the field and snap. It doesn't make any sense. Like those injuries, you can't predict them. Those are impossible to predict.
No. I mean, the only prediction of them now is that they're going to happen because these guys are so trained, and their bodies are so
probably overdeveloped
musculature overdevelopment, and so they're just probably wound a little tighter than they are. But I mean, I blew out my ankle last year. I'm not an athlete anymore. And it's funny, it's just a genetic thing based on how my body is. Like I have incredibly high arches in my feet, and the tendon I blew out, it's like 90% of the people that blow out that tendon are like only 10% of the population. Like it's just one of those freak things. And so that happens, so a guy like BJ Ojulari, it could just be, a thing where it's just a genetic thing. Hopefully it's not. Hopefully this was just a fluke, and he's like Tyrann Mathieu or Carson Palmer, or guys that have come back and had not just, good careers, but incredibly successful careers. But as Jess said, like the unknown with ACL injuries or ACL repairs is just so broad. And, everybody likes to point to and assume like, well, it worked for this guy. This guy came back immediately. It's like, not everybody's the same. And we look at Tyler, right? And we say like, hey, everything he's doing right now, trending in the right direction. That's a good, and I've even said it on the show, like obviously the injury itself is not good, but the resulting, change of mentality and the way that he has embraced the grind from it has been, a positive in this situation. But we still don't know if it means that like he's going to be able to be a long successful career. Because I mean, that's the crazy thing about like a guy like Mathieu, right? Like this dude blew his ACL out in 2015. He was still one of the best cover safeties in the NFL.
Yeah, well, and that's after it took a full 2 years, because the Cardinals, I mean, in 2018, they were like, yeah, we don't love you anymore. Like you can come back if we kick a pay cut. Because that, like 2017, he looked completely average, but he
right. No, you're 100% right, Justin. So that's just it. Like we'll obviously we want to see what BJ can do and hoping that he comes back and he's healthy. But the reality is we just won't know until I guess next year at this point. But
yeah.
they at least have Zaven on the roster, on the team, in the lineup for the next 3 years now, obviously including this year. And that's big because that is a massive question mark still. Like
Yeah.
we know they're excited about Zaven. They were extremely excited about BJ Ojulari, but now it's just back to like, let's see.
Their starters are Zaven Collins and Dennis Gardeck. Something now, and Gardeck, in fairness, led the team in sacks, 6 sacks last season. And he is a fantastic player. But at the same time, he is limited in some things. He's not ideal on first and second down. He can do it. He can drop into coverage. He can do that. But like, he's not the guy you want as your, for me, I want as my third edge guy because he can play, but you don't have to have that necessarily, that liability. And that leads to, what we want to talk about now is, will someone step up? Who can fill that void? And looking at what they have, what can they do outside the market? If you just look at on the roster, you've got Gardeck, but now if you're expecting him to play 50 to 60% of the snaps, or they go by committee like early last season, which is kind of interesting last year because before Ojulari was a significant part of the rotation, that's when they had their best pass rushing, their best sack production. Zaven got his sacks early. Gardeck mostly had his sacks early. Demikage's 4 sacks came early in the year. But you look at those and, nobody except for Gardeck had any sacks over the last 6 games of the season. Even Gardeck's, we've joked about, that wasn't really a sack. That was Justin Fields running out of bounds for no gain when Gardeck was a yard or 2 away. Like if he goes forward a foot, it's not a sack. But you look at the roster, and there's one player that I think we both look at and you're like, I wish he could be the guy because we thought he was going to be that 2 years ago, and that's Cam Thomas. But both Cam Thomas and Vic Demikage, who really kind of had a fantastic start to last year. Cam was inactive as a healthy scratch the last 2 of the years. Demikage was inactive 2 of the last 3 games of the year as they were looking at Tyreek Smith and they had BJ Ojulari. I mean, Cam Thomas should be the guy that we're looking at, and look at where he's in the depth chart. He's a bubble player right now, and I think he makes the roster. But if BJ Ojulari doesn't get up, we don't even know if he makes the team.
Yeah, he's definitely, and you hate saying it in this manner, but he's definitely the biggest benefactor, right, of that injury, because it seems like it's given him new life from being, a 5-10% type of guy to make this roster to 50, maybe even higher. So we'll see how it goes, but right now, I mean, this roster in terms of what they are and what they have, you're just looking at guys that desperately need to show us something before we can really have an opinion on the situation. And you said it, man. I mean, the idea that you go in with Zaven Collins and Dennis Gardeck as your starters is not, it's not exactly what you wanted in year 2, right?
No, I mean, that's nothing against Dennis. You just don't want him to have to be one of your top 2. And when you look at the roster and you say, so they have to go outside of the organization. But here's the thing. That's a highly unimpressive group. Like you say, trade for Matt and Judon. Pats and Judon are having issues right now. Judon wants to get paid. He was holding out of training camp. So that's an option. He's also in his 30s. He's coming off a year where he only played 4 games. And yes, he would be expensive. Now, is he worth it? I would say he's worth it, especially if you have any hopes. Like if you believe a little bit that this could be a postseason team, you trade a 3 for him, and then you give him heavy guarantees for 2-year deal, and then if he's productive, he can go get paid again. I don't know if I'd do anything past 2, maybe 3 years, but I am okay with him at Judon. But
like you said,
he does come with risk. He's an expensive risk.
Well, it's exactly like you said, Jess. Like he has to be willing to take that type of contract and be willing to do that. And we just don't know if that's what he's like. I mean, this isn't obviously the Patriots that we grew up with, but it is still, a guy that was built in the Patriot system and Jared Mayo that Judon knows. I'm assuming they actually played together, probably, right? Like, when did Mayo retire? I would assume that they're pretty close to playing together, but it is a situation that it just isn't so cut and dry as like, hey, just trade for this guy. But if it's an option, I would agree with you. I think that's something that you have to explore, at least to see if like you can do anything. I mean,
yeah, because the free agent options, let's be honest. Now they did make one move. They signed Marquise Haynes. If there were ever a move that wouldn't move the needle, he's a guy that does it. Not that he's a bad. He's got 14 career sacks. He's 30 years old. Last year, he only played in 7 games, had 1 sack. But in 2022, he played 17 games, had 470 defensive snaps, and had 5 sacks, which kind of matches the type of, say, Dennis Gardeck type production if you had him as that. Now, would he have more? Could he be, if he came in, get acclimated, can be in that starter role? I'll have you know he started 2 games in his entire NFL career, so he's always been an off the bench kind of guy, a rotational pass rusher with 14 career sacks. So I don't think that's a bad move, but it's kind of like getting the 30-year-old version of Victor Dimukeje, or just slightly more accomplished.
Right, and like you said, it just doesn't move the needle. I mean, it's not a bad move, and it's a depth move, but it's not going to change anything. And quite frankly, the fact that he wasn't a guy that they had pursued with BJ Ojulari on the roster is telling that you're like, oh, we think, or we want to see BJ Ojulari before we bring in a Marquise Haynes, right? Like, and that's not a bad thing. Like, it's not a bad thing at all. It's just, it just tells you kind of what you need to know about Marquise Haynes. And again,
it's just the names are unimpressive. Like, yes, the one name on here you're like, yeah, go get him, is Yannick Ngakoue. He's not quite 30. He's productive. But here's the thing. Have we heard anything about him wanting to be anywhere in the West? And he's the type of player.
Well,
like, who knows if he even wants to play for the Cardinals?
But not just that, just let me ask you another thing. Why has he never had a second contract after he left Jacksonville? Anywhere. Literally anywhere. So, like, I wrote about it the other day. It's like maybe he is the perfect, like, 1 year, like, oh, Ojulari's hurt.
Well, Clowney kind of became that, right?
Right.
Because so talented, but maybe, like, and I'll say this, the Cardinals are really careful about the guys they bring into this locker room. And if he's a great pass rusher, but doesn't have that team over me mentality, I think they're going to rock with. So if you could get 12 sacks, who's a slightly selfish player, who's more me, they would rather have the 8-sack team player, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And so, we'll see what happens, man. I mean, this is a big injury. And that's saying something for a guy that's really never done anything, right? Like, this is a big loss because it just is more than anything else. It's, what are they going to do? How do they get out of this, and how do they make this work moving forward?
Carl Lawson was an absolute bust in New York. Charles Harris, Tyus Bowser, they all come with injury concerns. Hey, if you want him, IJ Sanders still out there, but
right,
he flamed out of here. So it's like you want the Cardinals to go do something. And really, I guess the only one that sort of makes sense is going to trade for Matt Judon, because as we talked about in the offseason, the edge class in free agency for the price that it is very underwhelming in terms of what you're going to get for the money you're going to have to spend. And so closer to the beginning of the year, it's could you go get Justin Houston? I mean, he's ancient, but if you treat him like Dwight Freeney in 2015, so he becomes, and you feel good. And here's the thing: if Houston can produce anything in a limited role, and you feel good about the first and second down play of Dimikage and Collins, which I think is a good first and second down base unit, I'm not against that. But everyone wants the Cardinals to do something, but you look at the players available and you're like,
right. You're not sure that there's like what or if they can do.
Yeah, and so you end up, because like the moves they're making, they're not to replace BJ per se. They are depth behind whoever they're going to put in the lineup instead, because right. He's not a better option than as Dennis Gardeck. There may be, like, Marquise Haynes is probably, like I said, he's Victor Dimikage, but a little bit older, and then you have to maybe hope that Collins becomes a better pass rusher, that Xavier Thomas shows something, that Cam Thomas in year 2 in this defense can show some of the promise he did as a rookie, because he feels like he's completely flamed out, right?
Right, exactly. And that's kind of how you have to look at it, right? Is that this is a group that they need something, but I don't know if there's actually an answer out there for that something.
Coming up next on the Rise of Seer podcast, the best our Cardinals talk on the web. We have some news about who's playing and who's not playing in the preseason. That's coming up next on the Rise of Seer. We're back on the Rise of Seer podcast, the best our Cardinals talk on the web. Jonathan Gannon told reporters, media members in attendance to practice on Tuesday, that Kyler Murray would not play in the preseason, a move that neither Seth nor I are surprised about a bit. In fact, on our show last week, we said we didn't think he would. Gannon says he likes where he's at. He wants to have the best version of himself. And let's be honest, Kyler, if he was going to play at all, might have played a series or two this week and maybe 2 or 3 next week. So for what would come out to 20 game reps, the risk of him getting hurt just didn't, especially when they have a joint practice next week where they can get those same those live game opponent reps without the risk of him getting hit. That's what makes sense to me. It didn't make any sense, and I think that's completely the trend that you have to go across the NFL now. Unless you've got a guy that you need to get reps, Kyler doesn't need reps this year in this offense because he had half a season last year.
Yeah, and it's one of those situations that, as you'll explain shortly, they've got a plan in place of how to get him important game reps in a much more competitive yet somehow safer environment.
Yeah, and that's how look. Let's kind of go down the list. Now we're going to go through both sides of the ball, who we think will play or not. Running back, would you guess if Kyler's not playing, Connor's not playing, is he?
No, James Conner can't see the field in them.
That doesn't make sense at all, especially a guy who does get hurt. A running back.
Yeah, all the time.
Like, this is where you give Trey Benson those carries. This is where you get Amari DeMarcado those. This is where you give Michael Carter those chances, because Michael Carter's not making this roster. You give him a chance to make another team. The wide receiver room is interesting because I think Marv needs reps. I don't think he'll play much, but I don't think there's anyone in the receiver room you're just like, no, you don't need to play. I think Marv gets limited reps. Like, he gets the starter treatment along with Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch. But the rest, I think, will play, I think.
Yeah, and, it'll be interesting how they decide, or how much they decide to deploy Marv. Not just because obviously he needs to get some acquaintance with the NFL game and speed, but also, how do I put this delicately? How much do you want him to have to deal with Desmond Ridder and Clayton Tune, right? Like,
that's true.
Like,
that's true. And also this. How much do you want him going against non-starters who are battling for the roster on the other side of the ball?
Right, exactly. And it's just, I assume I wrote today, I think 1, maybe 2 series.
That's my guess.
In game 1. And if anything, he'll do the same in game 2. And then obviously he won't be anywhere near the field in game 3.
Yeah. Offensive line. Well, I think on the tight ends, Trey, don't put Trey on the field. Let the other guys. Obviously, Tip needs the reps. Elijah Higgins, who's 1 year into playing tight end, needs game reps. And literally everyone else, they're battling for spots on the roster. I'm guessing no one on the projected starting offensive line will play. I don't think Paris will. I don't think Jonah will. I don't think Will. I don't see especially he's just now coming from an injury, and I doubt Evan Brown does. So I'm guessing none of the starting line, offensive line, because they kind of know who they are. So I'm guessing none of them will play.
By the way, we probably need to mention that Yelda Froholt didn't die, so everybody calm down. I know that that's the hard part about training camp, and our media does a fair job, and I don't hold them exactly responsible, but it does set off a panic, right? Like, when a guy gets taken off the field, and even as many times as you say, under his own power, walked off on his own, blah blah blah, and then he's not there the next day, it's like, oh no. And so Yelda's back, but as Jess said, like, why? Evan Brown needs the reps on the line. He needs the reps with the guys. Like, just leave Evan Brown in there. Let him get some reps at center. Let him get some reps at left guard. And the rest of these guys, maybe you can tell me Jonah Williams needs some reps, but he's a veteran at this point. Like,
that's why I'm like, they're going to limit those, and especially the ones they know are their starters. Right. I think they don't need it, and especially, again, they're having 2 competitive joint practices with the Colts next week. Their starters can get those reps, and I think they will get the majority of those reps next week as well. And so you kind of do that, and then you game plan a little bit for the Colts that way, and you play your backups. On the defensive line, I think the only 2 that won't see action are Justin Jones and Bilal Nichols. Everyone else, I think, is on the table. Darius Robinson needs those reps. LJ Collier, it needs those reps. Dante Stills needs those reps, and then everyone else behind them need the reps because they need to battle. They need the opportunity to show what they can do.
Speaking of Zaven Collins earlier, do you think Zaven sees the field at all?
I would say he needs him, but my guess is.
Do you think that?
No.
Do you think
after BJ gets hurt, I don't think Zaven or Dennis will play.
And then Kazier's probably a no.
I would guess. I bet Mac plays.
Plays,
especially because here's the part that I think here's the little non-secret secret. Based on what I saw on Saturday's practice, we're probably going to see Mac Wilson on the edge quite a bit, and so we're going to see Chris Barnes or Owen Papo or when they go to, or the three safeties, or however they decide to do that, that one of their options is going to be Mac Wilson off the edge, who actually played quite well down the stretch, getting a lot of edge reps last year for the Patriots.
Right. So yeah. So I think you're right. Like the other question you have is like, how do they disperse these reps in this game? Because as you said, as much as you want these guys to start getting reps, at the same time, we're talking about, guys that have played a lot, guys that have had a lot of success. Um, we know that they're getting into a new system, so that means we want to see something from them. But at the same time, it's like we've talked about this, that depth is still razor thin. Razor thin. Now the high end depth is obviously much better,
Right.
but the full depth is just not ideal. So yeah, we'll see kind of how that plays out.
At the defensive backs, I don't think Sean Murphy-Bunting will play. Garrett Williams might not play because he's hurt, but after that, I hope Max Melton comes back, because he's been out with an injury, but I wonder if he'll be able to practice on it this week to get in the game. Star Thomas will play. Their guys are young enough that they're going to do it, and I think then you won't see Budda Baker or Jalen Thompson. This is the list of guys in my mind. They're not playing in this game, especially with the joint practice next week. And
I mean, why even put Budda and Jalen on the field? Like you got Rabbit, you got Andre Chauchere, and then you've got a bunch of guys that need to earn things, right?
And so if you take those guys out and you kind of treat it, even that still gives you plenty of guys because you normally play with 47 players and maybe 46, 45 get into the game, and so you're still got plenty of guys. If you've got 15 or 16 you're just saying no aren't playing, you've still got 70 that you've got available to play, so you still got reps to do that, even though you're trying to ease them in and try not to get them hurt. But yeah, I those are the guys I don't expect to see hit the field in the preseason. All that means we're going to see Trey Benson, we're going to see Amari DeMarcado, we're going to see a lot of Tony Jones at running back, we're going to see a lot of Andre Bocellia, we're going to see these guys. Xavier Weaver is going to get a lot of playing time. So yeah, this is kind of what you want to see, especially the starting jobs. You have guys play if they're battling for a starting job, but if you know that, I mean, just let's not worry about it. Let's not worry about it. It's year 2 in the system. Yeah, and so this year's different. And Marv, like, I want him to get reps, but starter reps. Like he and Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch will get a couple of series, and they're like, okay, that looked good. Come on out, and then you give Desmond and Clayton the back end guys to throw to, and there is this train of thought that you might have even the starting offensive line go a series or two for so that you can see Desmond or Clayton behind the starting line. But even then, I'm like, no, don't do that.
Right.
That's my idea. Coming up next on the Rise of Sierra podcast, the Best Star Cardinals talk. One last segment to talk about. We're going to discuss the depth chart. The depth chart and what we're surprised about or not. That's coming up next on Rise Up Sierra. We're back on the Rise Up Sierra podcast, the Best Star Cardinals talk on the web. And the Cardinals released their first depth chart of the year on Monday with their game release. And I don't even know if you would consider any of them a particular surprise, other than, for me, the surprises were, one, that Trey was ahead of Trey Benson was ahead of Amari DeMarcado. And then, honestly, none of it surprised me, because I get why DeMarcado's behind Benson, because he's kind of less backup running back than he is third down back special teams.
Yeah, and he seems to be the guy, we talked about it last week, that has really embraced his role. And I since we've gotten on this podcast, Josh Weinfest uh, tweeted out an interesting anecdote about Zaven Collins, somebody we mentioned earlier, but what they look for, right, and what they want, and just kind of um, why a guy like Zaven is so important to this team. And you look at the words that Jonathan Gannon talked about, he was talking about before he got his 5th-year option declined, and he said, I'm going to be here every day, I'm going to work on my game, blah blah blah. And Gannon's response was, I appreciate that about him, I really do, because you want guys like that can put on their blinders and go to work and be team first guys. That's who we want around here. And that kind of, to a T, defines Amari DiMercato, right? Like,
Yes.
Whatever you ask me to do, coach, I'm going to do it. Like, I don't care. I genuinely don't care. I'll do it. And again, when we're talking about 3rd, 4th running backs, that's the mentality and the attitude you have to have. And you talked about it last week, man. Like, a guy that wasn't even a starter in college, like, that's
and he's a lock for the roster. Like the way the Gannon talked about him last week, he's a lock for this roster. That's crazy.
Right. And again, it tells us everything we need to know about what they're looking for. As cliche and silly as it sounds, they're looking for football guys, like guys that care about playing football, that all they want to do is play football. And that's what who these guys are and what they want to do. And so it makes everything else kind of easy and fall into place.
I was interested in seeing, and I know the backups, the starters make sense, but when you go to the backups and how they have guys listed, I'm like, you can't trust it all the time, because, like, say you've got the backup center behind Yelda Froholt is listed as John Gaines, though we know that the actual backup center is Evan Brown, who's a starter at left guard. So they don't list things perfectly like that, and the way they list positions, because you've got like the.
Well, to be fair, didn't Jonathan Gannon even say, don't pay attention to that?
Yeah, he did say that. He did say that on Tuesday. We have to pay attention to it. And here's the thing. Here's kind of the secret on the depth chart, because it's not the coaches putting it together. It's the media relations department that put it together. So they see what we see and maybe get a little input. Like Mark Dalton might get a little input from Jonathan Gannon, but nothing significant. I did find it interesting that where Zay Jones was listed was the backup slot. Although we all know that he is wide receiver 4, and you talked about on the last show, he's a perfect fit at all 3 receiver positions. But I find it interesting that, like, where he's put at is in fact at backup slot.
Well, and I think it goes and speaks to what kind of we've talked about, is that he's had an excellent camp, and it's not as cut and dry as like, oh, Greg Dortch has been here, he's our wide receiver 3. It's just that Greg Dortch has outperformed Zay Jones, who's been performing extremely well in his own right. So, it's one of those situations that you're like, this isn't a problem. This is an actual good thing. And again, we talked about it last week. It's not something that we even really discussed last year, because it wasn't something that was real, right? Like wide receiver depth, we were like, oh gosh, this is bad every week. And now it's like, hey, we have a guy that we're super comfortable with being our X, our Z, or our slot at any point. Obviously, ideally, he wouldn't be that, but if it comes down to a game or two, no big deal. Like, we're fine.
Right.
Everybody's happy. And so those are hard things to quantify, because you rarely see that.
The defensive line, the 3-player starter, the 3 players listed right behind them. I think that what tells you is that, LJ Collier listed as the backup nose, even though he's not really a nose, but the fact that they put him there ahead of Kairos Tonga, I think kind of tells you. I think with the defensive line, the depth chart tells me a little bit because on my last two depth chart, on my 53-man predictions, I have those 6 guys are the guys that are making the roster. And the fact that they I know that Bilal can play nose. And so Roy Lopez continues to be kind of like Lecky Fotu last year. Like, surprisingly, he's just there. Lecky, his role grew, and he was just starting nose tackle. And it feels like that Roy Lopez has kind of gotten the Lecky Fotu role, and that now Tonga probably is, I'm going to call him firmly on the bubble because obviously Darius Robinson is going to make the team. I was a little unsure about LJ Collier as a potential guy, but he wants to be here. He was their best interior rusher last year at this point. That there was a lot of excitement about him. Then you got Dante Stills, who I think is firmly kind of established himself on the team.
Yeah, and I think Stills is kind of the perfect example of what we talked about a little bit earlier, in that, like, I don't know if he's ever going to turn into a guy that signs a big, $10 million a year contract a la Nichols or Justin Jones, right? But I do think he's a guy that can carve out a career where he's on NFL rosters for 8 to 10 years, and makes, a handsome amount of money over his career, because he has the juice to be a pass rusher. I don't know if he can consistently be an every down player, but that's not a bad thing, right?
No, if you're a rotational 3 to 4 sack defensive interior guy, you're going to play in the NFL for a while.
And I think he's starting to embrace that role, and if he does that, he's a guy that, in 2 years, or after next season, they come to and they say, hey, here's a 2-year, $5 million deal, and everybody's happy, and joy and all that stuff. And so
yeah.
But yeah, I think it's those 6. Tonga is the interesting one if they end up keeping 7. But
Yeah.
with that Ojulari injury, it kind of throws a wrench in that, because now you might have to keep 7 outside backers just to give yourself
to figure out who it is. Although the fact that Mac Wilson can play off the edge, Darius Robin can kick outside, does give them a little bit. I think that we didn't, and honestly, you know what, we didn't mention Darius Robinson. His presence also, I think, is helpful, and maybe perhaps that is how his role increases a little bit this year, is that you see him kicking outside more than we would have anticipated him in his rookie season.
Right. So it'll be interesting. But I think for now, you have a really, you have a decent group that needs a little help. But if Darius Robinson turns into what they are hopeful he can be, you could be looking at something that's very, very successful moving forward.
Yeah. At cornerback, like inside linebacker, nothing surprising there. It's Kaiser Mack. Back behind him is Chris Barnes, Owen Papo. And that's fine, whatever. Outside linebacker, the things I take away, Victor Demikeji is listed ahead of Cameron Thomas. Dennis Gardeck's up front, and you've got Jesse Laquetta ahead of Xavier Thomas. I'm real interested to see how that plays out. I know Thomas is, he's a rookie, a day 3 rookie at that. So I'm not looking too deep in that. The only one I look at, I'm like, Vic over Cam. I'm like, okay, that's what I see in that, because they both play that same position. I would say that Cam is, like, if you're listing them like their top 4 is Zaven, Dennis, Vic, and Cam before you go to Laquetta. That said, the fact that Vic is ahead of Cam, it still says a lot to me.
Right, exactly.
At cornerback, Starling Thomas is listed ahead of Max Melton as a starter at cornerback. This is kind of how it's been in training camp, though. Early in camp, Max Melton, before he got hurt, he was getting first team reps. So he and Star were alternating or sharing first team reps. Sean Murphy Bunting, Garrett Williams, Keitrell Clark ahead of Elijah Jones, 3rd round pick. You got Devad Wilson listed as Williams' backup in the slot, and Jaden Davis behind him. Not that I expect him to even be a consideration, but Keitrell Clark ahead of Elijah Jones. That tells me something right now, and we both know that cornerback room is going to be interesting because how many are they going to keep? Because if they keep 6, you're shorting another position somewhere, and if they keep 6, does that mean like who's out? Do you keep Bobby Price for special teams, or does Keitrell stay? Because Star Thomas really kind of looks like he's got the spot, unless he's just Christian Matthew again, which I don't think he is.
Right, exactly.
At safety, nothing surprising there. Rabbit and Andre Sasher are the 2 backups behind Jalen and Buddha. After that, it doesn't really matter. Although, interesting, Darren Hall, who's listed on the roster as a cornerback, is listed at safety. And that, I will say this, when I was back in OTAs and minicamp, that's where I saw him working. He wasn't working with the corners. He was working with the safeties, but he's still listed as a corner on the roster. As the return specialists, Dortch and DJ Dallas are both listed as the number 1s, with Amari DeMarcado and Chris Moore behind them at kick return, and Xavier Weaver, the undrafted rookie receiver, listed as the backup punt returner. So we'll see how that goes. I do fully anticipate DJ Dallas will have a prominent role because Dortch especially is going to play. I think it'll end up being definitely DJ Dallas plus another player on the kickoffs. You have to have 2 back there. And then I'm unsure whether it will be Dortch or DJ as the punt returner. And maybe if they keep 6 receivers, that's how Weaver makes his spot on the roster, is that, okay, you can be punt guy.
Right, exactly.
And other than that, I think that'll kind of wrap up this edition of the show. Seth and I will probably sit tight on a show until after the preseason opener, till next week, and we'll probably kick into the 2 shows a week for us. In the meantime, we will have more from Howard Balzer this week. We'll see about next week we've got more from Howard this week. Next week we'll be back, and after that, we're getting close to the regular season. That wraps up this edition of the show. That's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. Thanks for listening as always. We'll be back again soon.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up, See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, See Red, and of course, Rise Up, See Red.